Who I am, like where I've been or what I used to be, is not important. Enough to know I've never been anywhere and returned empty-handed. I've made calls, and those calls have been returned, if you know what I mean. I have files people would die for. Maybe some have already. I'm a devotee of dishonorable data. I detect disgrace. I log lies. I bank bad behavior. And I scrutinize scandal. Then and now.
He was indeed the superior fighter of the world. There was probably no fighter alive that could have stayed in that ring with Jack Johnson more than a few rounds if he so desired. He was considered one of the greatest defensive fighters of all time. He knew how to pace himself. And then when it was time to close it out, Jack would knock his opponent out, sometimes with ferocious force.
If there were a Pulitzer Prize for dividing the races, he would have won gloves down. As he went on his way, he loved fast cars, fast women, and slow gin.
Heavyweight champions are supposed to spend too much money and drink too much and waste away and die young. But black men are not supposed to date white women. They're not supposed to marry white women. They're not supposed to consort with white women. This is what drove the country crazy about Jack Johnson.
Never make me no underdog, and never talk about who's gonna stop me. Well, ain't nobody gonna stop me.
Cassius Clay, born in the segregated South. He fights his way from an Olympic gold medal to heavyweight champion. He tests the times and challenges white society. He joins the radical black Muslims of Malcolm X. He changes his name.
Muhammad Ali, right, Muhammad Ali, that's my name.
He is charged for failing to register for the draft, and the World Boxing Association strips him of his heavyweight title. But Muhammad Ali is not the first African American to spar with white society. 50 years earlier, Jack Johnson, the most famous black man in the world, partied with some friends on a train. He partied hard. He partied with white women. According to one companion, she had sex with Johnson in Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Having sex wasn't illegal, but crossing a state line for immoral purposes was. Jack Johnson was now vulnerable. The law could be bent. He would be cut down to size.
And Muhammad Ali said, you know, I'm free to be me. I think that's what Jack Johnson said to America back in 1908, 1910. I'm free to be me. You know, not who you want me to be, but who I am. And America couldn't accept that when Jack Johnson was champion. And I don't think they accepted it when Muhammad Ali was champion.
Johnson was the quintessential bad nigger. He refused to accept the dictates of white society, refused to accept anyone's directions and dictations on the manner in which he should live and how he should express himself. Without a doubt, he becomes the first major African-American hero of the 20th century.
Jack Johnson was born in Galveston, Texas in 1878, just 15 years after the freeing of the slaves. By standards of the 1890s, he is a massive man, self-educated, articulate, and street smart. At the turn of the century, he enters a fight game that is murderous. At its lower levels, a quasi-legal blood sport held at private locations and rural fairs. The rules are slack, and the results are brutish. And the only measure? The ability to entertain a crowd. And Jack Johnson excels.
This time there were traveling boxing shows, and he was in one of these shows. And it probably involved a certain amount of talking and drawing crowds in and showmanship. So he learns his craft. He learns his craft in the ring, but he probably also learned his craft outside of the ring, how to talk. 1902, 3, 4, he certainly has a reputation as a very, very good black fighter.
One thing must be understood about Johnson and his place in heavyweight boxing history.
and that is that he was basically a defensive fighter. He would, skillfully box these guys, and in that process, he would punish them. As a counterpuncher, he would make them pay for their mistakes.
He was the most scientific fighter there was. He was the most skillful, and maybe even the smartest.
As a fighter, there was never any doubt that he was among the greatest.
And Jack Johnson wins something called the Negro Heavyweight Championship. But the real title is out of reach, beyond the white line. Dominated by a clique of fighters like Gentleman Jim Corbett and John L. Sullivan. And they all hold a single rigid opinion on who is allowed to get a shot at it.
And when John L. Sullivan became champion, he issued his famous challenge. He said, "I'll fight any man, first come, first serve, but I will not fight a black man."
The color line applied only to the heavyweight championship of the world. That's the big daddy of them all. The lighter weights were significant, but they really didn't mean a lot. But the heavyweight champion of the world was symbolic of the strength, the manhood of America.
In 1899, Jim Jeffries wins the title. Jeffries is good, too good. The heavyweight championship stagnates for 6 years for the lack of a white contender. Jeffries sits it out on his alfalfa farm, and America loses interest in the fight game.
The rumor had been, and it was one that got a lot of currency at the time, that Jim Jeffries had run out of white opponents and didn't want to dare fight the black opponents, all of whom were the best in the division. So he just retired.
Because Jeffries retires undefeated, the heavyweight title eventually goes to a Canadian, Tommy Burns. Burns needs the money and starts looking for a fight.
Then takes off with his crown, puts it under his arm, and gone. Johnson now takes off after him.
And suddenly, Johnson sees his big chance. Maybe, just maybe, Burns will fight anyone, anywhere.
There were some feelings that this fight could not take place in America. So Johnson actually began a campaign with his promoters to follow Burns any and everywhere for a fight. So here becomes the pursuit. In this age of social Darwinism, in this age where black and white are at polar ends, promoters come up with the idea that maybe we can exploit the predispositions in this country to what would happen in the ring. The idea of a black man fighting a white man.
So Jack Johnson follows him to England. Fight me. You want to fight? You want a good fight? You want to fight the best man? Fight me. Doesn't. Goes to Australia. Johnson dogs him to Australia. You want to fight the best man? Fight me. And at that time, there's a promoter, a guy by the name of Hugh McIntosh in Australia, kind of a interesting, the Don King of his era. And he convinces Burns for money, for enough money, to fight Johnson. And Burns figures, what the heck? So even if I lose, it's a big payday. So he says, okay. John L. Sullivan says in an editorial, an article he wrote, "Shame on you, Tommy Burns. Shame on you for ever fighting a black man for money. For shame."
Sydney, Australia, Rushcutters Bay, Boxing Day, 1908.
Ladies and gentlemen, the defending world champion from Hanover, Canada, Tommy Burns. And from Galveston, USA, Jack Johnson. 45 rounds for the heavyweight championship of the world.
And they get it on. Well, they really don't get it on. Jack London, covering the fight, said, "Fight? There was no fight." Johnson knocked Burns down in the first round, then toyed with him. Started coming and crying at him, "Come on, little Tommy. Let me see what you got. Come right here where I want you."
And Johnson would laugh, and he kept taunting him. And then eventually he got a little bit more cruel, and he started to hit him and hurt him and cut him up and break him down. And, you know, the inevitable, everybody could see what was going to happen.
But Johnson was so superior. Johnson was a magnificent defensive mechanic. Johnson, by comparison, was a great artisan of the sport. He was a great scientist. He understood, had a great sense of timing. And poor Tommy Burns couldn't get a lick at him at all.
What that fight was a very large black cat toying with a very small white mouse. In the 14th round, the policeman had had enough, even if Burns hadn't. And they shut down the cameras and jumped in the ring and stopped the fight. And Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world. The white man's burden had become his master. And it unleashed a wall of hatred as white America decided they wanted to reclaim their heritage, their right, their title.
People who weren't interested in boxing beforehand now suddenly said, this isn't about boxing anymore. This is about racial supremacy.
Johnson returns from Australia in triumph. He's dogged by reporters. America sees the champ for the first time. He's flashy, extravagant. He wears fine clothes, drives fast cars. He marries Etta Duryea, a sporty, well-to-do white divorcee. Mixed marriages are beyond the pale of polite society, but tolerated in the bohemian underworld of the fight game. Johnson celebrates. Burns hadn't landed a glove, and Johnson has energy to spare. Marriage does not slow down the champion's high living, and Etta endures a string of humiliations as he tours by train with an entourage of women. One, Belle Schreiber, is a well-known prostitute. The train propels Jack Johnson and Belle Schreiber across state lines and into a legal nightmare that will haunt him for years.
Jack Johnson was a promoter in and of himself. He knew what he wanted, he knew how to do it. And if he had to prick society's mores, tendencies, and proper attitudes, he would.
One thing that he would do was to wrap gauze around his penis to make it look larger, and the press would pick up on this and write about it, and it would just infuriate people of how this man is flaunting himself sexually.
It frustrates white America because not only is he doing this, he's doing it with a heavyweight crown perched atop his head. So he's not just a fellow who's having these leances with white women. He's a fellow that every American, white and black, knows, and he's flaunting it.
But for Johnson in 1910, fame comes with an equal measure of ridicule in the mainstream press. For African Americans, however, Johnson represents something very different.
Johnson was a vicarious substitution for them in their lives. For all of the frustrations that they had to put up with, all of the indignities, all the inhumanities because of racism and discrimination, they could identify with this guy who was beating up white men with his fist in the ring and making white America quite angry.
The image of the Negro as beast, the Negro as rapist, the Negro as a lustful creature of white women clearly emerges in the minds of a lot of people who were considered to be Negrophobes, people who just hated blacks and wanted to keep them in a subservient position. And Johnson's fetish for white women was very obvious, and something had to be done.
Something had to be done, but who could do it? A new phrase entered the American lexicon.
For the first time came that cry, we must find the great white hope. Jack London for the New York Herald.
So you had all these plowboys and gandy dancers and rodeo riders coming forth as the next white hope. They were going to take it back. They were terrible. The best fighter out there was a middleweight, the middleweight champion, Stanley Ketchel, the Michigan Assassin. And there was never quite an assurance that he was human in the ring.
He was a brutal middleweight. You know, he's the kind of a guy that you have to kill before you could knock him out.
So, on October 16th, 1909, America puts its money on little Stanley Ketchel. But nobody's optimistic.
Come the 12th round, Ketchel leaps in with a swinging right, catching Johnson behind the ear, and down goes Johnson. And he puts out his arm and sort of steadies himself, but he does go down. I mean, he's visible. Pops right back up, and as Ketchel runs in for the finishing touch, throws one deep dish uppercut. And Ketchel goes out, sort of lying there like crucifixion on the canvas, while Johnson leans against the ropes and picks 4 of his teeth out of his glove.
The hopes of millions fade with the 10-second count. Who's left to save the white race?
Well, the heavyweight division at that time was totally devoid of talent. It was Jack Johnson and the 7 Dwarfs, literally. So what does the white hope hysteria do? Starts drumming for a fight with a man who hasn't fought since 1904 and was the undefeated heavyweight champion. P.S. He was white. James J. Jeffries.
He was a hero of gigantic proportions in those days. People felt that Jeffries could not be licked by anybody.
Jack London writes in the New York Herald, "One thing now remains. Jim Jeffries must emerge from his farm and remove that golden smile from Jack Johnson's face. Jeff, it's up to you. The white man must be rescued."
He's 300 pounds. He has no desire to come out of retirement. He probably knows that his body's not ready for it. But the pressure becomes almost irresistible. I mean, it's not win the title back for yourself. It's win the title back for every Caucasian that breathes the breath in America.
And Jeffries bought into it, because it had a lot to do with great white civilization being dominated by a black champion.
Now it moves from the sport pages, and it goes to the editorial pages, and it goes to the front pages, and it goes to the barbershops, and it goes to the pulpits, and it goes to the universities, and it goes to the organization. It permeates all of society. It is the first great fight of the 20th century, and all of America found themselves sucked right into the vortex of this major event.
The first matchup of big money sport and mass communication. No television, no radio even. The latest electronic miracle? Ticker tape. Special private wires from ringside. The message is flashed to every town in America and boomed out by megaphone.
And they would be reading it out in front of the newspapers, at all the very, very ritzy clubs that could afford their own teletape and ticker tape. At great gatherings, there was a couple theaters that just charged admission to have somebody there with a megaphone so that they could read each round. Johnson lands the left and the right to the head. Jeffries comes back with the right to the body. And then they'd sit and wait for the next ticker tape.
But the motion picture camera is the big moneymaker. The film is scheduled to be shown in theaters a few days after the event. Given the huge national interest, a promoter stands to make a fortune, and the ante just keeps going up.
Well, the best offer comes from a man named Tex Rickard, a miner, a prospector, who offers $101,000 to the two, split 60-40, winner gets 60, and they sign.
Tex Rickard was an American original. He establishes saloons in Nevada during the gold rush, and then he turns to boxing, and he becomes a promoter, and he promotes some early fights, and he eventually will become the great promoter of Jack Dempsey.
Rickard schedules the fight of the century for July 4th, 1910 in San Francisco, but runs up against the decent citizens of California.
California was a pretty big boxing state at this time. There were a lot of matches held. However, there was a governor, Governor Gillette. There was a lot of pressure put on Gillette, political pressure. Do not allow this fight to take place in California. That it was the epitome of what was wrong with America. That we want to show California as a modern, progressive state, not some type of retrogressive arena. So it can't be held. Gillette says no, so it's forced to Nevada, to Reno, and Reno says fine.
And the world comes to Nevada, Reno. Gamblers from all over, pickpockets, Tong leaders who killed people, everybody's there. And all over town, whiskey signs are hanging, and just a grand old time. So this basically was almost a tent revival for the reclamation of the heavyweight championship by its savior.
Before the fight, Jim Jeffries bears his soul to the nation. I realize full well just what depends on me, and I am not going to disappoint the public. Just how I feel on the eve of battle? That portion of the white race that has been looking to me to defend its athletic superiority may feel assured that I am fit to do my very best.
Jim Jeffries was a big man, but he came out and he swung hard and he hit a lot of air. He couldn't find Jack Johnson, and anyone who knew boxing knew that he's throwing big punches. They're loaded up punches, and when they're not hitting anybody, he's going to lose his energy. And so by the mid-rounds, by 7, 8, it's clear that he's not going to win. And Jack Johnson is taunting him. But then, again, Johnson starts to turn to the task, and he starts to cut him down, he starts to hurt him. He knocks him down, and it's for many Americans, it's sort of a sad, pathetic sight of this seemingly invulnerable bull mountain of a man just suddenly becoming small.
The fight lasts 1 hour. Jeffries hits the canvas for the first and last time of his career. He retires quietly to the alfalfa farm, but America reels from the blow.
Pretty much shook up the world. Pretty much shook up the world. At that single moment that Jeffries goes down, the white race goes down.
Blacks celebrate and whites take to the streets. The ultimate Jack Johnson nightmare. Race riots, anarchy, murder.
Riots broke out across the country after the fight. Black people, particularly black men, were attacked in several cities: New York, Washington, D.C., and many southern cities, Charleston, South Carolina, Atlanta, places like that, where this anger and disbelief that our great white hope was defeated, and defeated badly.
And Tex Rickard's dreams of avarice slowly crumble as white Americans debate the release of the fight film.
Should white men suffer the indignity of watching this black man repeatedly beat this white man in the ring? Isn't enough enough? They talked about it in the United States Congress. The concern over these fight films was to that extent. So much so that they passed a law forbidding the importation and the showing of fight films in this country, a law which lasted some 20 years before it was repealed.
Once again, Jack Johnson is loudly triumphant. He and Etta travel to England and France, international celebrities. Riding the crest of his fame, he opens a nightclub on Chicago's South Side, the Café de Champion.
It was a big cafe, bar, saloon. And I'm sure if you wanted to place a bet, if you wanted to find a prostitute, you could find action there.
He lives high. He drinks too much. To Etta's continued humiliation, he takes up with Lucille Cameron, the cafe's 19-year-old bookkeeper. One September evening in 1912, Etta returns home alone. The once racy divorcee is enraged and then finally drunk and depressed.
Here was a white woman married to the most hated black man in America at this time. She was probably, despised by a lot of blacks. She was certainly despised by most whites. She probably was a bit fragile and unbalanced to begin with. She was an alcoholic. I guess she decided in one day that she couldn't take it any longer and she shot herself.
Etta's suicide puts Jack Johnson back into the headlines. He bears the brunt of the blame. And once again, the press highlights his relations with white women. But he has little regard for those who are plotting his sure and certain downfall.
To understand Jack Johnson outside of the ring, it is almost required that you have some understanding and some sense of what it was like to be black in America when Jack Johnson was champion. When Jack Johnson was heavyweight champion of the world, better than one black man a week was being lynched in America for being accused of being intimately involved with white women.
Governor Cole Blease of South Carolina stated his own opinion of Johnson's behavior. There is but one punishment, and that must be speedy when a Negro lays his hands on a white woman.
If Americans believed in three things, white America believed in three things. It believed in democracy, it believed in capitalism, and it believed in racism. Anything that threatens any of those pillars, those institutions, is a threat to America. And Jack Johnson is a threat.
This man was an embarrassment to the white community. This man was being sermonized against and preached against and pulpit pounded against, and every good sermon heard in every tent in America.
It was clear by 1910, 1911, 1912 that there were no white boxers on the horizon that was going to eliminate this threat, to knock them out, to get rid of them, to shut them up. Therefore, how do you do it? You have to go at him in another way, and what they decide is to go after him in the courts.
The task of building a legal case against Jack Johnson falls to Agent Charles DeWoody, chief of the Bureau of Investigation in Chicago. DeWoody remarks, "Johnson is an undesirable American who deserves no mercy from the courts. But on what charge? Something would have to be trumped up. Enter the White Slave Traffic Act, the Mann Act. It is a federal offense to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. A loosely worded statute written to protect young white women from being forced into prostitution and taken across the country. Jack Johnson is not a pimp, but he is traveling with white women."
When this case was first posed to the Attorney General of the United States, the Attorney General said, this is a perversion of the Mann Act. It's not what the Mann Act was passed for. But then the investigator said, well, this is the only thing we can get Jack Johnson on. So the Attorney General, and it literally what is a smoking gun document, says, if this is all you can get, go after him.
And there is Lucille Cameron, the latest Johnson lover, young, vulnerable, and white. Her mother is already clamoring for a charge of abduction against Jack Johnson. DeWoody seizes Lucille and threatens her with jail if she doesn't testify against him. He has a case, but Lucille has a scheme of her own.
Lucille gets out and turns around and marries Jack Johnson. She's not going to testify against Jack Johnson, so they look for somebody else. Well, when you're looking at Jack Johnson's life, there's always somebody else. There's a string of somebody else's.
Enter Belle Schreiber, late of the Everly Club, the most luxurious and expensive brothel in Chicago, and definitely a Johnson traveling companion. Would she testify?
Sure, she testified that, yeah, I saw Jack Johnson in New York, and we had sex, and we were in Atlantic City, and we had sex, and we were in Chicago, and we had sex, and we were in Pittsburgh, and we had sex, and I guess he's guilty of the law.
There was no profit for Johnson for going across state lines with Belle Schreiber or any others, but he did cross the lines, and that's what he was prosecuted for. America, Black America in particular, strongly objected to that prosecution, persecution as they have called it.
In 1913, the protests go right to the top. The letters and telegrams pile up at the White House door.
In the name of human justice, I ask you to interfere with the frame-up case against Jack Johnson, which
My
is
dear
in the
sir,
hands of the
I am
federal
herewith
government.
calling your attention to the most disgraceful act of the U.S. government in trumping up several cases against a man of the Negro race, Jack Johnson of Chicago. I ask, as
Mr.
probably
President,
you know more than I
while the
myself,
colored people of New York condemn the folly of Jack Johnson, they ask you respectfully to stop this persecution by the federal authorities of Chicago because of his race. Yours most respectfully, George W. Harris, The Amsterdam News.
Johnson, to keep himself out of jail, was involved in a paying scheme to federal officials and state officials. And that's well documented in federal records in his case file, that he was paying these people money.
Johnson's mother complains that he's being bled dry. He pays out more than $60,000 to Charles DeWoody and other federal officials to help his case. Attorney Benjamin Bacharach says, "We'll fleece that nigger before we get through with him."
In fact, his family took some deposition to report to federal officials that this was going on and it was really draining him. And there was lots of money involved in this scheme here to keep him out of jail.
The trial is swift, less than a day. Guilty is charged. In one of the great ironies of the century, a black man is convicted of white slavery and sentenced to 1 year in federal penitentiary.
He had an all-white jury. You know, there wasn't a black person on the jury. There wasn't a woman on the jury. It was a jury of 12 white men. And to get I don't see how any lawyer could have gotten him off, really.
He is allowed out temporarily on a bond of $15,000. And what happens next is a mystery. Years later, Johnson will say that he left the United States pretending to be a member of a Negro League baseball team, traveling to Hamilton, Canada. No one ever corroborates the story.
It made a good story that, you know, Jack Johnson engineered an escape with a Rube Foster and a black baseball team from Chicago. It makes a wonderful story.
The federal authorities know that if Jack Johnson does his time, he will be out within a year, still the undefeated champion and still public menace #1. But if he skips the country, well, that's a whole different story.
I believe that he got in a car and he left. We have messages from the authorities wiring saying, you know, Jack Johnson's leaving, Jack Johnson's here, and it's going back to their authority, to their head, and the head is saying, don't do anything. But if you force him out of the country, he can't return to America, and he's not as much of a threat. It's sort of out of sight, out of mind.
What we do know is that on June 29, 1913, Jack and Lucille leave Montreal aboard the SS Corinthian. For Jack Johnson, now a fugitive from justice, England and France look very inviting. Few race problems, only good times and money to be made. Celebrity appearances, fights in London, fights in Paris. The most famous on June 27, 1914, against Frank Moran, a Pittsburgh Irishman with an impressive record. Cafe Society is there. Maurice Chevalier, a Vanderbilt, a Rothschild. Sporting princes and potentates. Johnson defeats Moran after midnight, and later that day, a Serbian student shoots the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and war rolls across Europe. Suddenly, for the first time in years, nobody in Europe is interested in Jack Johnson.
At the beginning, he had an entourage, but entourages are funny things. You know, when the money disappear, they tend to disappear too. They're not known for their institutional loyalty. And so they're pretty much gone. Jack Johnson is pretty much on his own. And, you know, it's hand to mouth. The man's not a wealthy man. And, you know, he's doing various things, and he's appearing here and performing here and boxing an exhibition there. It's whatever he can to get money.
He fought a couple other times around the world, but basically he had put his title in cold storage. And there were still White Hope championships going on in the United States. There was one man out there, Jess Willard, who was reputed to be the best. Jess Willard's already killed a man in the ring. He's got to be powerful. And so two promoters got together enough money to stage a fight in Havana, Cuba in 1915. Jack Johnson versus Jess Willard, the White Hope.
Havana is not unlike Reno. You know, it's wide open. Gambling. The sports, that crowd could get together. Again, the ones who could make their way down to Havana. And so it was a good city to hold a heavyweight champion fight in.
115 degrees, the second fight of the century. But the press is wary. Willard could turn out to be great, white, and hopeless. But at 37, Jack Johnson is no longer in his prime. The gambling fraternity debates. Has he still got the old magic? Is the fight fixed?
Now, Jess Willard was not a great fighter, but he was a pretty good defensive fighter. He was very big, and he had long arms, and he was raw bone, and he was pretty strong. And he could take a fairly good punch. And so Jack Johnson hit him repeatedly. Willard didn't go down, and Willard would tie him up, and Willard had a reasonably good jab that could keep Johnson away. By the 12, 13, 14, 15, in around there, it's clear that Jack Johnson is starting to tire.
26th round, Willard smites him right on the point of the jaw, and Johnson goes down in the dying gladiator throwdown and is counted out.
Later, Johnson will say that he threw the fight in an attempt to cut a deal with the Justice Department so that he could return to America without serving hard time. The federal government has always denied this. The debate will be forever driven by fight fans and strong drink.
Did he throw the fight? I don't think so. I don't think so. But again, makes a good story. And Jack Johnson was always about a good story.
If there's any one thing that I think demonstrates that he had run out of gas, when you see Jack Johnson, mid to late 30s, laying on that canvas in Cuba, notice his knee when he hits the carpet. He's laying on his back, and his foot is planted firm, and there's an angle in his knee. And at some point, it just collapses and it goes out straight. I've seen that before. That's the sign of a defeated fighter, not somebody throwing a fight.
Ironically, beating an aging black fighter on the lam proves to be a hollow victory. As America enters the First World War, Johnson drifts ever closer to home. He opens the Main Event Cafe in Mexico. He lashes out at racial segregation in America.
He was an extremely bitter man. And I think he took any and every and all occasions to criticize the United States of America, and rightfully so. There were no havens for African Americans in Mexico nor in Europe, but he knew that he stood on firm ground when he would say, "It's better than in the USA." And indeed it was.
Nevertheless, after 7 years in exile, Johnson throws in the towel. No longer a champion abroad, he cannot stay away. The 42-year-old Johnson contacts federal authorities and crosses the Mexican border at Tipiana on July 20th, 1920.
And America was home. He liked America. He knew people in America. There were things that he could do in America. There were opportunities in America. And so it was sort of, well, I've got to take my medicine. I've got to serve the time.
A common criminal, Johnson suffers the indignity of mugshots and fingerprinting. He's not charged with fleeing justice and serves only his original 1 year in Leavenworth, Kansas. He does easy time. He is appointed athletic director.
He was a model prisoner. The warden said he was a great guy. I mean, and he was. He was a nice person. He was a likable person. People that met Jack Johnson really liked him.
Johnson pays the full price for the heinous crime of crossing a state line with a white woman. He is now free to pick up his life. But he is fated to cross the white line one more time. This time, it will prove to be fatal. After 8 years, Jack Johnson is no longer big news, so he takes his show on the road.
Times have changed a little bit. Now he's the old Jack Johnson. There's not a lot of hate, a lot of animosity towards him. The treatment of Johnson is a little bit different than the treatment of Johnson in 1910. He's seen as the old fella, the old champion. And the fight game has changed. He's a relic of the past.
Though he changed America forever, the aging Johnson discovers that his homeland has little to offer.
Jack Johnson made money where he could make money. He was in a flea circus. You know, in New York, he would get up and tell his life story day after day after day, and people would listen to him.
And I actually saw him as a kid. In the early 40s, my mama had brought me to New York, and there he was at Humbert's Flea Museum, little beret on his side, showing people for $1 how he would do something or other, and I don't remember a hell of a lot more.
In 1924, Lucille Cameron, like Etta Duryea, has had enough. But Lucille sues for divorce on the grounds of adultery, and Jack pays up. A year later, he marries Irene Pinault. Curiously, this time there's not even a ripple of scandal. Johnson is just an aging has-been. His threat to the sacred pillars of America long past, Johnson becomes an amiable sideshow. At 68, he tells great stories. He rides on past glories at exhibitions and dismal carnivals. But Jack Johnson refused to stay down. He saw his place in history as the greatest fighter who ever lived, and he never believed that he was anything less than an American legend.
I have been requested by many to tell just how I knocked out so many of my opponents. As far as I'm concerned, that day has gone. And today, I have a new way in knocking them out. And I will show you.
I was 6 years old when he beat Tommy Burns, and 10 years old when he beat Jim Jeffries. 14 years old when Jess Willard beat him. He was an outstanding fighter at a time when nobody thought that any colored fighter could be outstanding. He was an anachronism because he became a champion at a time when nobody expected a colored guy to become a champion. He was an anachronism because he decided he wanted to marry a white woman at a time when that was very unpopular.
1946. Speeding to New York in one of his fast roadsters, which had always been one of his hobbies, along with fast women. He went off the road in North Carolina, coming to the Lewis Kahn second fight, June of '46. Smashed into a tree and was killed. The line by John Lardner. It's one of the best lines in all of sports. Jack Johnson was killed crossing the white line for the last time.
They broke Jack Johnson. They chased him out of the country, jailed him, and turned him into a carnival sideshow. But ultimately, he broke them. In his own way, he jabbed and punished and wore down American attitudes for all those who came later. His whole life was a fight just to be Jack Johnson, the one prize that no one could ever take away.